Rochester was known as the capital of fine tailoring in the country. We may not have had the same production levels that were coming out of New York or Chicago, but it was really known for the best quality, and we're very proud to have maintained that tradition and that heritage. It really is an honor and a privilege to be working with Ralph Lauren to dress America's athletes for probably the most prestigious sporting event in the world.
That was a snippet of a commercial that was run in 2016 promoting the opening ceremony uniforms of the United States Olympics team when they went to the Rio Olympics. And obviously I worked on that project. We were manufacturing it. Those are my hands sewing those brass buttons and sketching and cutting. And we're going to look at how we can recreate that button that was used in that opening ceremony uniform. I just thought, since we are currently hopefully nearing the end of the pandemic and hoping that the Olympic Games that were supposed to happen in 2020 may happen this summer in 2021, we're still not sure. And so in that spirit, I thought, let's do something Olympic themed. So in Blender, I'm going to assume you have a basic understanding of Blender. This is not a how to use Blender video. If you're new to Blender, I highly suggest you go over to CG Cookie. They've got some great introductory stuff. That said, I will try to walk you through all the steps of this and not skip over things assuming you know everything in case there's steps that you don't know. So the first thing I'm going to do when doing this button is I'm going to start with a new mesh. So by hitting Shift A, I'm going to click on Mesh and select a cylinder. And obviously that's not the shape of the button that I want, so I'm going to hit S, which is going to scale, and then Z, because I want to scale just in the Z axis. And when that blue line pops up, that tells you that we're just scaling in the Z. So I'm going to bring the button down and make it something like this, because as I look at the edge, there's sort of a rim that looks roughly that thickness. We're in object mode, so I'm going to hit Tab to go into edit mode, and then hit 2 to go into edge select mode. And holding the Alt key, I will select this edge, and so it puts a nice loop around for me. And I'm going to hit I to inset, and I'm going to inset this a couple times. So I'm just making a nice shape, which we're going to make our dome. Now if I were to use the grab key, G, and just pull this up, it's just pulling the inside. So what I want to do is I want to go up here and turn on proportional editing. So we have the choice of what kind of shape we want in proportional editing, and sometimes you just have to sort of fiddle around to find what you want. In this case, since we're going for, it's not quite a sphere, it's kind of between a sphere and a root. We could go either way, but let's start with a sphere. So we select the sphere and then click on this button to turn it on. And so this time, if I were to grab that face and pull it up, see, it's moving everything. And maybe we don't want the whole thing to move, but actually kind of looks, yeah, it looks not bad. It looks like our button, so I'm gonna leave that. If I go into object mode and right click and shade smooth, it's going to show us how Blender is interpreting the edges. And I still think it's a little too chunky, so to get a little bit smoother, I'm going to apply a subsurface modifier. And what that's going to do is, instead of actually creating additional vertices and edges, it's going to simulate them. So I go over to here, this wrench, which is where all the modifiers live. They're cool tools. Go add modifier, subdivision surface. So you can see how it's changed the shape of my button. But in our case, we want to maintain some of these edges. It's smoothed off some of it a little bit too much. So the way that we're going to correct for that is we're going to bevel some edges. So again, with 2 selected and the Alt key held down, I will click on this edge. It selects the edge loop, and I'm going to hit Control B and pull out a little bevel. And it's not doing exactly what I wanted, and it's probably because when I scaled, I didn't apply the scale. So let's go back and hit Control A and apply the scale. Go back into edit mode, hit 2 again, Alt, grab the ring, Control B, and then pull with the mouse out. And it's only giving me 1 edge, and I'd rather something a little bit rounder. And so I roll my mouse wheel up a few times, and that's giving me a few more of these subdivisions so I can control how I bevel my edge. And you see how that the form underneath is starting to change. It'll be more dramatic when we do the one underneath. So again, 2, hold the Alt key, grab that loop. Let's bevel that. So Control B to bevel. Oh, my mouse is being silly today. And that looks, let's go into object mode. That looks a lot better. That's more like the shape that I want. So the next thing we need is we need a shank. And the shape of this shank is kind of rectangular. And if I was going for total realness, I would spend a lot more time on it. But because I want to focus more on the Substance Painter function, we're going to cheat. We're going to make a shank that doesn't look exactly like this one in real life, because you're not even going to see it in my rendering. It's hidden under the button. So the easiest way to make a shank would be to let's go back to object mode, hit Shift A, add a mesh, and I'm going to create a torus, which is basically a donut, but it's too big. So I'm going to rotate it by hitting R, and then I want to rotate it in the X axis, so I'll hit X and then 90 on the number pad, and it rotates at 90 degrees in the X axis. R, X, 90, and enter there. And then we're going to scale it down. So bring it down to something like that. That looks about right. And I'm not going to move it into place just yet. Let's look at it shaded, smooth. That looks okay. And again, we're not going to see it anyways. So the reason I'm not moving it up is because we need to unwrap the UVs, and it's usually best to do it where your seam's not going to be obvious. I talked about UV mapping in another post, so if it's completely new to you, I'll try to link to that in the text of this video. So in order to get into the UV editing mode, we go up to this corner and pull a screen aside. So we're going to be able to see the mesh, and then we're also going to be able to see the UV map. So up here in this corner where it looks like a railroad track, and it's the editor type, and right now we're in the 3D viewport, I'm going to change this to UV editor. And I have nothing selected, so there's nothing showing up. If I were to select this, go into edit mode and hit A to select all. It's done an okay job of unwrapping it, but it's not exactly what I want. So I'm going to define how we're going to unwrap it. I want this map to come and wrap around this edge. I don't want any visible seam here, because that can be ugly in the texturing. I'm going to put the seam underneath. And so again, with that 2 selected, holding Alt, click, that grabs that loop, and then I right click and say mark seam. I'm going to do the same thing on the shank, and the reason I have it pulled down here is because I want to put this seam where we're not going to see it. So back into object mode, select the loop, tab back into edit. See how it's unwrapped and it's kind of bizarre. So with the 2 again, I'm going to select, and I'm going to try to, oh, I did it. Sometimes it grabs a different loop than the one you wanted. And so I'm going to right click and mark seam, and then we're going to go underneath and click there. That's what I wanted, and mark seam. And now let's look at it from this side. G to grab Z to constrain to the Z axis and move it up into my button so it looks like there's a part. So now we go back into object mode. These are two things, so cylinder, torus. I should have renamed them to button and shank, but we're going to grab these two and hit Control J to join, and now it's one mesh object, and I'm going to change the name to button underscore USOT for US Olympic Team. And now I'm going to wrap again. So tab back into edit mode, hit A, and see now it's totally goofy because we've got UV chunks sitting on top of each other. So now I will hit U and select unwrap, and there's my button, the top of the button, the bottom of the button, and the shank. So we have our UV map, and it's usually, I like to save the UV layout because you can use that in Photoshop. So where we're going to put this, custom button, USOT, and you're getting a sneak peek of the next step. So USOT underscore UV, because we can use that for texturing in Photoshop, which we're not going to do in this case, but just in case I wanted to, I like to have it available. And then the last thing I need to do is export this OBJ. So we're going to export away from OBJ, put it back in, where is it? Custom button, USOT, and call it USOT underscore button. Here we have our UV map layout, which we unwrapped in Blender, and now we can apply the displacement map for our button. The alpha that I had created for Substance Painter can equally be used as a displacement map. Let's just copy this and paste this. I'm going to hit Control T to transform. You know, I'm going to change my opacity so I can see what I'm doing. And these rings here, whoops, these rings right here, that was the outer extremity of my button. So I know I need my white line to be within that space. So that's what I'm using as a guide. I'm just going to scale it out. And that looks about right, maybe a tiny bit bigger. And maybe too much. Yeah. Now remember, with the displacement map, everything that's white is raised and everything that's black is not. And so, just to not confuse the system, I don't want any of this blank space. So I'm just going to fill, I'm going to fill the rest of the area with black to be sure. So I can just go to New Solid Color and a pure black and just drag that layer beneath my displacement map, and there it's correctly mapped for our UV button. So I would save this as I'll save it as a USOT UV displacement. There's a new interface in Clo since the release of 6.1, I believe, to register buttons, and unfortunately there's a bug in it as of this recording. Normally I work in inches and in line for my button size, but there's some goofiness going on, and so I had to change to millimeters for this tutorial. Probably the rest of the world is all on millimeters anyway, so you'll feel right at home. So to register that button, I'm going to go to Materials, Button, and Register Button. And we can call it USOT, but in this case I already have one because I made one from Substance Painter, so we'll call it 2. I'll use the same thumbnail. And then here I have the choice of making 1 or 2 or many sizes of button, and in this case I want to make 2, so I will hit plus. And so size name, I'm still going to call it 32 line because I'm old-fashioned that way. And the size of 32 line happens to be 20 millimeters, so we're cool with that. But it's a shank button, so it's a little thicker, so I'm going to set this to 6 millimeters. And then I'm going to go to my second one and call it 24 line. And this one is 15 millimeters. and 6 millimeters thick. So I need to grab my OBJ and then repeat the same for the other button. And let me have a look at I've got my OBJ, the sizes are correct, everything looks fine. Okay. Now this is registered as a button preset, but it's just going to be blank. There's no metal, there's no decoration, there's no nothing, so we still have a little bit of extra work to do. So I'm in the object browser, and under the button heading, I'm going to add another button and call it USOT Brass 2. And in the property editor, next to shape, there's this little arrow drop down. And I'm going to go find the button I just created. I want a 24 line in this case. And now we have some extra work to do. So we're going to change this type from fabric matte to metal, because this is a brass button. And then the color, we want some kind of brassy gold, so maybe we'll start there and bring it down to about that. We're going to play with it in a minute and play with the roughness as well. And we need a displacement map. And so hopefully this is going to work. This is the first time I'm doing a displacement map on a button, so we're finding out live how well this works. So my displacement map, and then let's go find, here it is, cross our fingers. Set the amount to say 0.25 because it's really not a lot. And metalness is set at 100. Yeah, roughness 10 is probably going to be too shiny, so I'm going to set it up to something like 20. And then we will add our button to our sleeve. And the thing about doing it with a displacement map is that you can't see it live in the window, so I don't know if my map is lined up correctly. Whereas had I done it with Painter, I saw the preview of it in here, and I knew that it was turned around, it was upside down, so I could do my adjustments in this window. We'll have to do that in the render window. So I still prefer to do it in Substance Painter, but I know not everybody has access to it, and so I thought I'd do this version for those who don't. And get in there. Buttons are being strange this morning. Now let's go to the render setting, the render window. And get in real close. And look, it worked. But they are upside down. So the way I fix that is I click on, with my button selection tool, click on it in the 3D window, and then I go over to angle, and I'm going to turn it. Now normally I would see the preview if I had done this from Painter, but now we're just going to have to sort of guess it. Let's do one. We turned 120, and let's refresh to see how that worked. We need a little bit more, so it's probably more like 180. It's not quite, so 170. Let's say 174. See what that does. That's a little bit too much, but you know what? That's fine. It's good to have some variety and some realness. So let's put one to 180 ish, and then one to 170, because people put things on a little bit crooked in the shop, and then maybe another one to 185. Let's type it in instead. This one's a bit too much, so let's go turn that one And there, if we get real close and have a little look. Think about the displacement maps is it can distort things a little bit. Some distortion I'm okay with because you would normally have a little bit of this in real life because nothing is perfect, but I don't like it. So we're going to turn the amount down a little bit. We need to keep some, otherwise we're going to lose. Oh, I hate that when I scroll through things and you hit the wrong, and I just undid. I don't know if you noticed this. What was happening is I would scroll and I was over this, and so it switched from a PBR material to a substance material. I do that all the time. So let's reset it to metal. And I probably lost my texture. Yeah, I lost everything. Grr. Color, gold. And I'll probably have to turn everything around again. Maybe I won't. Maybe we'll be lucky. And instead of 0.5, let's set this 0.35. And I'm going to have to set the roughness. Say 25. I'm still getting that distortion. Let's go down to 0.25. See, but as we're reducing the displacement amount, we're also losing the raised effect, so it's becoming flatter and flatter. I'm probably going to leave it there, because if, well, let's try 0.1. Maybe we'll get the right, we'll hit the sweet spot. We've still got our surface information, so we can still make out the design, and we're about probably as close as we're going to get to something I like while still having our displacement effect. So I'm going to stop it there. But now you've seen how you could create your own images, and you know, Blazor buttons are very popular and very common, and you could design, you know, your own initials, your own logos. You could have a lot of fun creating designs and using these displacement maps to create your own brass buttons. And normally it would cost $1,000 for a mold charge for each size to do these things. So the fact you can do this stuff in 3D now is a whole lot of fun, and you can see the results, especially if you work on a design team and you're designing these buttons. You can create all sorts of versions of them, and you can all decide what the one you want before you start spending money doing molds and 3D printed versions of things. So it's pretty cool. So last thing, we're just going to look at some techniques in Photoshop afterward to give the image a little bit of extra punch. So I'll see you in Photoshop. In this shot, if I had shot this with a camera, in this very, very tight macro shot, I would have a very, very shallow depth of field. And so these buttons as my focal point would be in focus, and the rest would be very much blurred out. And while I could do this in Clo with some camera effects, I prefer to do it in Photoshop because I have more control in Photoshop. So my favorite little tool for this is going into the filter and the blur gallery and the field blur. So what I can do, you see it all blurs out. I grab this pin and I'll drop it on here, and I can control the amount of blur or how sharp it is. So I'm going to drop this pin here, and I'm going to drop another one here, and I'm going to drop it on each of these buttons just to really protect the focus on these buttons, because then I'm going to blow the rest of it out. So let's blur this out and blur this out. And this is kind of how a macro shot in real life in terms of focus would look like. So here's my finished image of my US Olympic team brass button. The next tutorial, we're going to look at a little bit more complex modeling in Blender and make a 4-hole button with some thread. So I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, like, subscribe, and do please join me on the next one.